The starting point for this roadmap is the reality, I think, that we have to remind ourselves constantly, that we live in a society that is still characterized by significant and persistent inequalities and human rights abuses. We know, for example, that only 1% of the population holds 40% of the wealth. A mere 26% of people with disabilities over 15 are employed. Less than 1% of travellers have third-level qualifications, and an extraordinarily low 16% of the candidates in the current election are women. We have evidence of human rights abuses in our prisons, in human trafficking, in asylum policy and the direct provision centres. And still they say that equality and human rights are not important. The origins of the Equality Rights Alliance and of this roadmap lie in this backlash against equality. The starting point, as Joanna has mentioned, lies in the undermining of our current equality and human rights infrastructure in 2008. But it's a backlash that continues with the current series of austerity budgets, budgets that diminish our public services, budgets that lower the incomes of those already on the lowest incomes, budgets that deepen the inequalities in our society. This is a backlash that incorrectly suggests that now is not the time for equality, and sometimes even that maybe equality has really gone too far anyway. Allied to this backlash, we now have a virtual disenfranchisement of equality and those who espouse equality. We have wall-to-wall political debate, but it has virtually no focus on equality and inequality. We have party policies on a myriad of policy areas: jobs, political reform, public sector reform, policies that all fail to grapple with or respond to the equality dimension of these issues in any substantive manner. Yet we know inequality and exclusion don't work. Despite the advice of former Minister Michael McDowell that a dynamic and liberal economy like ours demands flexibility and inequality, there is evidence that inequality was one causal factor of the crisis we currently experience, a driver for debt and borrowing, a reason for the collapse in consumer demand. And then there's also little evidence that austerity and accompanying inequality has brought us any closer to resolution. In fact, the opposite appears to be the case. In these times, in particular, I believe, we need a strong voice for equality and human rights. Because, as Joanna has said, equality works. More equal societies have fewer health and social problems. Businesses that invest in equality and diversity are more productive and innovative. Gender-equal labour markets are more effective and productive. We need an Equality and Rights Alliance to draw civil society voices for equality and human rights together in an alliance that offers strength and creativity and some hope of making a real impact. We need, I believe, this roadmap to point up a direction of travel for equality and human rights and to serve as a basis for our demands for progress on this issue over this time. This roadmap is not about repairing the damage that has been done by this backlash. It has greater ambition. It seeks a renewal. It seeks to establish the next generation equality and human rights infrastructure. It seeks to set out an effective and strategic approach to advancing equality and human rights. And I think the notion of infrastructure usefully captures the idea of the need for a set of interlinked component parts being required to advance equality and human rights. The roadmap sets out an infrastructure that encompasses laws that would set the standards we want to achieve in terms of equality and human rights, laws that would establish the means by which we would secure an accountability for these standards, especially when they're breached, laws that would offer protection to people from abuse, whether it's human rights abuse or discrimination, laws that would impose duties on key stakeholders in society to secure progress in this area. The roadmap sets out institutions drawn from both the statutory sector and civil society, institutions that would enforce and make real the standards that we set out in law, institutions that would implement the legislation and drive forward, champion and advocate for equality and human rights, It sets out policy instruments that would bring the equality and human rights objectives that we establish in law into all areas of policy making and achieve a coherence of effort across all public policy for equality and human rights. It sets out policy strategies that would bring equality and human rights objectives into the deployment of our resources, that we acknowledge that there will be political choices still to be made alongside the implementation of the law, and we need to secure positive action beyond what is required by law for groups experiencing inequality and human rights abuses. This has to be an infrastructure that is capable of building on what was achieved over the last decade, because it is important to acknowledge that the late 1990s and early 2000s were a period of valuable growth and development in our law, our policy strategies, and our institutions, and that this progress does provide a foundation for renewal. An infrastructure that would be capable of extracting and applying the learning from the experience of the last decade of implementing these laws and policy strategies. And above all, we need to acknowledge that we do need to go further in a context of significant and persistent inequality. We need an infrastructure that's capable of achieving new gains in equality and human rights. An equality and human rights infrastructure serves as the motor for the further development of a society characterized by equality and human rights. The roadmap is unlikely to be sufficient to achieve full equality in practice and the full realization of human rights. It is, though, the motor to take us the next steps along the way to such a society, a motor which in turn will need to be reviewed and renewed on the basis of learning from this new phase of promoting equality and human rights. So in terms of an infrastructure, we need an infrastructure first and foremost that would enable participation in devising strategies for equality and human rights, that would create a focus on equality and human rights, provide the framework to mobilize, to engage, and to involve people and organizations behind the goals of equality and human rights. Obviously, we need this infrastructure to drive respect for, promotion of, protection in relation to, and the full realization of equality and human rights. It is, after all, the motor for change. However, we also need to recognize that it's not by chance that equality is not a major focus in the current political debate. Equality still continues to lack popular traction within the general public. Those of us who espouse equality continue to be a minority, and we need to take on that challenge. So we need an infrastructure to champion and build public commitment to a society based on equality and human rights. And lastly, we need to acknowledge equality and human rights require structural change. Change in the way we organize our society, change in the way we go about our business as a society, change that goes beyond just changing individual attitudes and behaviors. We need an infrastructure that would secure and support organizational change, change in organizational practices, policies, and procedures, so as they would advance equality and human rights. Finally, this new generation of equality and human rights infrastructure would need to be based on 4 different principles. Firstly, the principle of ambition. We need an infrastructure that would move beyond the current emphasis on equality of opportunity, that would move beyond the idea that all we need is fairness in the competition for advantage. We need an infrastructure that would look to a levelling out in the distribution of this advantage, that would emphasize equality outcomes and real change in the situation and experience of groups experiencing inequality. We need an infrastructure that would go beyond the current emphasis on protecting and promoting human rights, an infrastructure that would emphasize the actual fulfillment of human rights and measures to realize the conditions that would enable all to live their lives in dignity. The principle of coordination is another key principle to underpin this roadmap. Equality and non-discrimination are a specific field within the broader field of human rights. There are particular instruments that set out specific rights in relation to groups experiencing inequality. There's also a requirement that human rights are underpinned by equality and non-discrimination. The provisions in many of the human rights instruments set out that the rights must be available without discrimination. But in Ireland and elsewhere, equality and non-discrimination have been separated out, and I think that does reflect a valuable and necessary prioritisation of equality and non-discrimination. It also usefully acknowledges specific approaches required in advancing equality and non-discrimination. However, Coordination of effort is required if we are to have an impact. Coordination so that equality and non-discrimination are pursued on the basis of a rights-based approach. Coordination so that the approach to human rights is underpinned by equality and non-discrimination and does take account of diversity and difference. So the roadmap sets out separate institutions in relation to equality and human rights, but looks for shared planning and a coordinated strategy for change. The third principle is that of integration, and that acknowledges that equality involves a range of different objectives. Objectives of redistribution in terms of how resources are distributed between people and groups. Objectives of recognition in terms of how diversity of people and groups is affirmed and the extent to which adjustments are made to take account of the practical implications of this diversity. Objectives of representation and the extent to which different people and groups have access to influence and get to have a say in decisions that impact on them. And finally, objectives of respect and the extent to which people have access to sustaining relationships of love, care, solidarity, and trust. We need an integrated approach across these four objectives if we are to overcome the current fragmentation of policy and programme in relation to poverty on the one hand and discrimination on the other hand, a fragmentation that serves as a barrier to real progress towards greater equality. We need integration if we're to secure a more comprehensive approach that addresses all dimensions of inequality, resources, power, diversity, relationships, and addresses the links between them, because not all of these elements are currently taken aboard and addressed by the current infrastructure. Finally, there's the principle and practice of advocacy. It's a principle, I think, that reflects the importance of civil society to the equality infrastructure, the equality and human rights infrastructure. Civil society made up of community groups, trade unions, citizens' information centres, public interest law centres, and many others. Civil society that plays key roles in providing a platform for people to participate in devising equality and human rights strategy, that provides space for people and groups to identify and articulate their shared interests as groups experiencing inequality and human rights abuses. Civil society that provides supports for people in using the legislation and in securing change through legislation. So the principle of advocacy stresses, I think, the importance of strengthening and developing civil society as key advocates for equality and human rights. So in summary, the roadmap seeks a new generation of equality and human rights infrastructure to build on what is there, to apply what we've learned over the last 10 years, and to make new gains for equality and human rights. It's an infrastructure of laws, statutory and civil society bodies, policy instruments for coherence, and policy strategies for the better application of our resources. It's an infrastructure that seeks to achieve equality outcomes and the full realisation of human rights. It's an infrastructure that would seek to coordinate strategies for equality and human rights and to integrate the equality objectives of equality in terms of the distribution of resources, of power, of recognition, and of relationships in our society. Thank you.